Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Today, we're going to do something a little different in our enriched read. We are going to talk about satire. Taffy Brodesser-Akner is one of our amazing satirists in, the present day. Her Fleischman is in Trouble is a book that I loved, and I really liked the television adaptation. Didn't love it quite as much as I loved the book, which is not always the case. People sometimes ask me if I just have ever seen a movie that I like as much as the book, and the answer is yes, for sure. But this is actually a very good segue into the reason I want to focus on satire. So the reason I liked Fleischman is in Trouble, the novel, so much more than I liked the television adaptation, was because when we were learning about Toby Fleischman in the book, there was an enormous amount of warmth. And I think a lot of that warmth did not translate into the television adaptation, which got me thinking about satire in general. I am someone who really likes satire. I like really clever wordplay. I like exaggeration. I like hyperbole. You all know that I am certainly happy to watch people misbehave and to make bad choices. So I am generally a fan of satire, and I'm very interested in the way that it works. I will say, however, that in Long Island Compromise, I felt like the satire lacked warmth, and that is something that we will discuss throughout the day today, because I think that really was at the germ of some of my dissatisfaction with the novel. So you all know it is not in the spirit of the Foxed Page to just be shitting on a book and just taking it down. And I definitely will tell you all that I will read books and I will not talk about them on the podcast because, in fact, they are books that just didn't sit well with me. And I'm not interested in bringing on a book and just sort of tearing it down. But I did have a listener say recently that one of the reasons she likes to listen is when occasionally I have some quibbles, and I talk about the quibbles, often because she can relate to some of those dissatisfactions, but also because her sense is that, there's a certain amount of credibility in a critique that in fact has, some critical things to say. So what we're going to do today is look at satire in general and look at Long Island Compromise, the way that it is working and the way that it is not working quite so well. It makes sense if we are going to talk about satire to have a working definition. As with all literary definitions and concepts, this is a little bit squishy in the sense that we're sort of trying to categorize the different elements of satire. And the good satire that we are going to look at today is often a mix of these different elements. So what in fact are the elements? The kind of standard ones that people think about are humor, irony, exaggeration, parody, sarcasm. And what I have to say, when I looked at one of the many definitions online, they also included ridicule and mockery. And part of me was like, that's not good satire. It's not good satire to be ridiculing someone. And then I realized that part of my dissatisfaction with Long Island Compromise is I did feel like there was a decent amount of ridicule and mockery. So we're going to take a quick look at that. And yes, I'm sure, satire is made up of ridicule and mockery in certain instances. But again, that is not satire that I find most effective. So we have all of these different elements which we are about to break down, but maybe the more important part of the definition of satire is what it is used for. So usually satire is a piece of writing or a piece of film where they're using all of these different elements in order to critique a societal ill. So we have a long, long history of this in sort of Western literature. You go back to Voltaire in the 18th century with Candide, or The Optimist. That was a book where, this very optimistic Candide was brought down to earth by all sorts of exaggeration and parody and everything else that Voltaire was throwing into that masterpiece of satire. Lots of you will remember from sophomore English the writer Upton Sinclair and the book The Jungle, which was in fact meant to be a satire of the class system, and it was meant to be sort of a socialist treatise. It was about the meatpacking industry in Chicago, and Upton Sinclair has been known to say that he was shooting for America's heart but landed in their stomachs, in the sense that that book ended up inaugurating a whole bunch of regulations where the food packing industry was concerned because people were so grossed out by what they were reading in this satire. But it kind of missed the mark as far as Sinclair was concerned, because in fact he wanted socialist reform and only got, some semblance of the FDA. So now that we've established the elements of satire, we'll take a look at a couple of really important works who I think do this very, very well. And we'll also look at the ways that Long Island Compromise both does it well and also, again, lacks a bit of the warmth that I think often is the key in terms of satire really being effective. Before we dive into satire, I want to just do a very brief general look at Long Island Compromise because the talk today about satire is going to end up feeling a little critical, but I really want to emphasize all of the things that I think are working so well in this novel by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. A couple of the elements that are really working well. The dialogue is incredible, really, really believable, really telling, really interesting, really broad in the sense that there are a lot of different voices that are heard. She has incredible details. There are so many details here that really give a lot of credibility to this narrator and really allow us to see this broad cast of characters and all of the antics they get up to. You really get the sense that Taffy Brodesser-Akner has done a lot of her research well. There's some stuff in here, it's just a very broad look at history and at the lives of all of these different people. And you get the sense that she really knows what she's talking about. There are a lot of terms of art which are simply words that are sort of familiar to a certain milieu or a certain expertise. And she includes them in a very effortless and organic way that really makes the reader feel like she knows what all of these different people and all of their professions are up to and how all of these different worlds function, whether it is the world of land use law, which we see with Nathan, or whether it is, really serious drug use with our Beamer, or whether it is academia with Jenny. You see all of these different worlds painted really accurately. All of that gives the novel a lot of verisimilitude. It is really a world that we feel like we are entering into. And yes, there's a lot of exaggeration and some of the parody and some of the hyperbolic stuff feels a little cute to me in some ways. But overall, I think she does such an amazing job of really painting this amazing, very detailed and believable world that we are feeling like we are stepping right into. The pacing is also excellent. So she really moves things along in a lot of ways. And this is a book that spans, generations, and she does it so deftly. You never get the sense of like, oh my God, we're going back in time to learn more about Zelig. You feel like story is both moving along very, very pleasingly, but also that you are getting plenty of depth with each one of the characters we are following. The structure is also incredible. There are lots of digressions in this book that I loved. So she will, begin with Jenny sitting in her bedroom. And then suddenly, we are moving back in time to Jenny's childhood, which is showing us all sorts of stuff about Beamer and Nathan. And then we are coming back to the point in the bedroom. And all of that, it feels very effortless. The reader is never lost. It's a very adept and a very good structure. The other thing with the structure that I loved is there are some real subplots in this book that really get cooking. You all know that I'm not someone who tends to read, first and foremost for plot, but I had some real questions, some real burning questions as I was going through this novel. I mean, just really curious about the history of this family, about the kidnapping, and about what happens with the factory. There's some really good tension that she builds that is really entertaining. And actually, entertaining is a great word for this novel. It has come up a couple times. I just saw it in People magazine. I was reading through my People. I'm a subscriber. Get my edition of People every Thursday afternoon. They did a thing on this and talked about how entertaining the book is, and it is. It is a book. As much as I was feeling a little critical of things like all of the fonts. There was a lot of playing with font in this book that I just was like, oh gosh, like this is just feeling too cute for me. Font that starts out normal size and then gets really tiny and then gets really big again, or different types of font that look like, Courier, that look like the typewriter, or that look like some sort of chalk duster or whatever that font is. Lots of different fonts in here that just never sits well with me. I'm not sure why. Well, it just seems like a little cute. And maybe like a little manipulative in a way that makes me feel like a little bit of a cheat. I feel like maybe the language needs to be strong enough, which it is in this book. So I'm not sure we needed to lean into all of these different fonts. So ultimately, entertaining is a really good word for this novel because I both was listening to it and reading, and I found myself really wanting to move through because I was very curious and I was really invested in a few of these characters. I got a little tired of them at times, but I really found it entertaining. So I want you to keep that in mind as we move through this conversation. We are going to dive into the question of humor, which is obviously a very broad category. And we are going to dive in with one of my very, very favorite writers, Lorrie Moore. We are looking today at her collection called Self-Help. And we're going to talk about this as a self-help parody. I mean, literally the name of the collection is Self-Help. So clearly this is a send-up of the kind of self-help books that people read. So that's cueing you right away to the fact that Lorrie Moore is in fact satirizing the idea of the self-help manual. But I want to take a look at humor. So humor obviously is a gigantic kind of umbrella category. And just recently, when we were talking about Lucia Berlin, and a couple of other times too, we talked about sort of how humor functions more broadly. And I very much like this formula that humor is, it's sort of this unexpected thing where you have, usually A plus B equals C. You have sort of this logical progression that the reader is expecting. And what is funny lots of times is that A plus B equals like 12 or something. So when we have Lorrie Moore, there is this really unexpected kind of language that just keeps coming at us, and everything's a little quirky and everything, again, is a little unexpected and sort of a little bit off kilter in a way that I absolutely love. You can just open to any page. I honestly just did it just now. I opened up to page four of self-help, and I just am looking at this one paragraph. And the humor in here is very satirical in lots of ways. This is in a short story called How to Be an Other Woman. And this is very much, in some ways, a send-up of what it is to be someone who is having an affair with a married man. And there is so much humor and so much warmth in this and so much sympathy with the person, who is usually the scorned other woman. And it's, again, I will say the key to this is that there's a huge amount of warmth and sympathy for someone who we don't necessarily always have a lot of sympathy for. So on page 4, we have this paragraph. Oh, and the other thing to note is that the entire collection is written in the sense of like a self-help manual. So a lot of it is in the second person, which I love. It's an imperative. That's the tone that she is using. So like do this and do that in order to, be happy, essentially, is the concept. And this How to Be Another Woman is very much like a how-to. It's sort of a manual here. She says this. After 4 movies, 3 concerts, and 2.5 museums, you sleep with him. I mean, 2.5 museums is so funny. It's I don't even know what a half a museum is, but it's unusual, and it conjures something in your mind it's like a funny story all unto itself. It seems the right number of cultural events. On the stereo, you play your favorite harp and oboe music. He tells you his wife's name. It is Patricia. She is an intellectual property lawyer. He tells you he likes you a lot. Oof. I mean, this again is not really what you're expecting. You don't necessarily expect him to tell you the wife's name and then right after say that he likes you a lot. You lie on your stomach, naked and still too warm. When he says, "How do you feel about that?" don't say, "Ridiculous," or "Get the hell out of my apartment." Prop your head up with one hand and say, "It depends. What is intellectual property law?" Lorrie Moore is such a genius. I mean, I wish that she wrote more novels. She actually did write a novel recently, and I loved it, and I started reading it, and then it was so heavy, I had to put it aside. But I will definitely have to go back to it because she's such a genius. But this idea here of, he says, "I really like you a lot, and my wife's name is Patricia, and she's a lawyer." And then we expect some sort of, show of emotion on the part of this narrator. And in fact, she's like, what is intellectual property law? It's unexpected. It comes out of nowhere. It's diffusing the situation. It's actually putting her in a position of power, which I think the reader really likes. So it's giving us both kind of respect and sympathy for this character. The reason why I keep talking about sympathy and now have included respect is because I think in order for satire to work really well, it has to be somewhat relatable. In my experience, I mean, I have never had an affair with a married man, so I don't know at all what this would feel like, but it's relatable enough. I've been to 1.5 museums, probably. I know what it's like to talk to someone about property law. So there's enough relatability here that we can sort of begin to understand this person. And then when we have the humor and when we have this kind of power position in some ways that she's putting herself in, we are allowed to relate and to have some sympathy and also to have some respect. Before we move on, though, to the Taffy Brodesser-Akner, I'm going to treat you all to a little bit of humor as we find it in Less by Andrew Sean Greer. This is a satirical novel. It's actually a pair of satirical novels, this Less and Less is Lost. I love these books so much. I did a lecture on them back in the bookstore, and I might have to revive it just because I think they're so excellent. And one of the reasons, again, why this book works so well is there's an enormous amount of humor. There's a lot of parody. There's a lot of send-up of the intellectual world and of the literary world. and of travel. And there's a lot of parody about being lovesick and about relationships and the sense of being desperate in them. So it's just a book that I love so much. And in the very opening, we have a lot of humor by Andrew Sean Greer that I really appreciate because, in fact, there is an enormous amount of warmth. And the reason why the warmth works here is because, in fact, our protagonist, Arthur Less, is seen as very vulnerable. We see a lot of vulnerability in the family in Long Island Compromise, but I would argue that because there's enough warmth and likability, that some of the vulnerability just ends up seeming kind of pathetic. Whereas in Less, here by Andrew Sean Greer, we're seeing a vulnerability that really makes us like Arthur Less all the more. This is the opening to Less. From where I sit, the story of Arthur Less is not so bad. Look at him, seated primly on the hotel lobby's plush round sofa, blue suit and white shirt, legs knee-crossed so that one polished loafer hangs free of its heel. The pose of a young man. His slim shadow is, in fact, still that of his younger self, but at nearly 50, he is like those bronze statues in public parks that, despite one lucky knee rubbed raw by schoolchildren, discolor beautifully until they match the trees. So I love this so much. I mean, we have the idea of aging here, which is one of the things that Arthur Less is sort of battling in some ways. We have this idea of him sitting primly. We have this idea of the sofa in the hotel lobby. There's a certain refinement. There's this beautiful description of the loafer. There's a certain way that we see him sitting there, and especially because we have this first-person narrator who is inviting us to look at him in this way, we have a sense that this is someone for whom life is going to be difficult. And soon, in fact, we realize that he is sitting and looking at a clock and the clock is broken. So right from the beginning, we have, it's almost a slapsticky kind of humor. The humor is somewhat broad, but you also have humor in these very small details. And again, there's this incredible relatability. I mean, everyone knows what it's like to age, at least everyone I know these days. So you have this sympathy right at the beginning. You can relate, even if you don't know very much about him. But we've all been in a hotel lobby, and we all have fought aging, and we've all been sitting waiting for things to happen, and we've all made mistakes and been late. So all of this allows relatability and a certain slapstick humor to ensue, which I think adds warmth and vulnerability that works so well. So now we're going to move on to the humor in Long Island Compromise. I think Taffy Brodesser-Akner is really funny, and I really loved a lot of the humor that we found in Fleischman is in Trouble, and I liked a lot of the humor here in Long Island Compromise, as long as it wasn't too mean-spirited. There were some things, she has a lot of kind of one-liners that I thought were so funny, and I really enjoyed them, particularly when they were not, in fact, mean-spirited. The first one we're going to look at, it just really struck me, and I think anyone of our generation who grew up learning about Roman and Greek architecture can relate to why this is funny. But I also will say that this comes at the end of a bit of a mean-spirited description of the suburbs. The details were just atrocious. Curling wrought iron gates and shutters that couldn't possibly work, and stone-ish siding, and my God, the columns. Corinthian, Doric, Ionic, tragic. So, of course, one of the things that's working so well here is the idea of Doric, Ionic, tragic. Also, this idea of Corinthian, Doric, Ionic. I mean, we all learn these things. We can all kind of visualize them, and it kind of, brings you back to like Western Civ. But then the addition of tragic and that echoes the Ionic and Doric, it's so good. Her ear is so good. But even here, this idea of the details were just atrocious, that kind of hyperbole and the kind of meanness, the word even atrocious, shutters that couldn't possibly work, and stone-ish siding, and my God, the columns. So you have this sense of really, pushing hard against these details that gets to feel a little bit like an attack on people who they don't have great taste. And yes, they have too much money, but ultimately I felt like there was a little bit too much negativity that we find throughout. On page 385, we have another one of these sort of one-liners that I think are very effective throughout Long Island Compromise. The ghosts of a family's troubled past will play out riotously in the soul and on the body of each member of that family in myriad ways. A staggering, sudden impoverishment to the comfortable, a seismic event from which a person may never recover. But have you ever tried to plan a bar mitzvah in the American suburbs? which is so funny. And this is humor exactly like I was talking about earlier. It's set up, we're set up to, families are so tragic. And like in the history of families, things have always been difficult in these seismic events. So you're expecting something huge and something very, very large scale. And then she says, but have you ever tried to plan a bar mitzvah? This is sort of archetypal satire in the sense that she's talking about the American suburbs. This is something, that should kind of clue you in to the idea that this is a statement about a broader situation, which is about American suburbs in general, and certainly American suburbs on Long Island. So I found this very funny and very effective. And this is the kind of satire that does work well for me because it was unexpected. So you have the funny element, but it also is speaking, to kind of the absurdity of the what the bar mitzvah has become in the sense of, all of the printed sweatshirts and all of the swag and all of the, the motivators. And those parties are really fun. And it's such a beautiful, beautiful ceremony. This idea, I wish that I had had a chance when my children were 13 years old to stand up and say amazing things about them. I find bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and b'nai mitzvahs incredibly moving. But I do certainly understand the idea that setting one up in the United States these days would be a very difficult task. We also have some really excellent one-liners. For example, on page 182, our narrator says, Nathan excelled. He did okay. So there's a lot of, like pumping us up and then bringing us down. And she does it so well because it sounds, in fact, like our narrator is almost a part of the family. And also in that case, you are generating, some sympathy. Like people are trying to imagine that Nathan has excelled and people are trying to be like, oh, he was so great. And then, the fact is he did okay. And then we have one last thing that we're going to look at here. There's a lot of tension, obviously, between Ruth and Carl, who are the parents in this family, and the three children. And toward the end of the book on 406, we have, again, this kind of very dry, understated humor that I think works very well. This is when the kids are saying, in fact, that the parents did not attend Nathan's bar mitzvah, their eldest son's bar mitzvah. That is the craziest thing I've ever heard, Ruth said. I did not realize that you would use my old age to malign me. No, to libel me. It's slander if it's spoken, Jenny said. Libel if it's written. Already, this is so funny. I like the idea that Jenny here is like getting into the weeds. And then Brodesser-Akner goes one step further in a way that I love. And she says this. So Jenny says, it's slander if it's spoken, libel if it's written. It's slander if it's false, Beamer said. It's not false. You weren't there. So it's so good. This is actually very like Lorrie Moore. Lorrie Moore will do something funny and you'll be just like dying because it's so funny and clever and smart. And then she'll take it one step further and you're like, oh my gosh, what can this woman not do? So I love the fact here that we have, a certain like first tier of humor and then she goes even further. So I do find the humor very effective, even when sometimes it's a little bit cutting. We're now going to go on to talk about irony. So irony, I think we all know that Alanis Morissette song, and people sometimes are very confused about what is ironic and what is not. The broader definition of irony is simply that it is something that it sort of turns out the way that you don't expect it to turn out. Often it's the opposite of how you expect something to turn out. In terms of writing and in terms of satire, irony is a little hard to pin down, and sometimes it reads quite a bit like sarcasm, and sarcasm is simply when you say something but you actually mean the opposite of it. But irony is when we do have something that is unexpected, which obviously overlaps with humor and sarcasm and all the rest of it. But we're going to take a couple of glimpses at some good irony. So one of the very best examples of irony, and in fact it's almost like dramatic irony, is in Long Island Compromise, and it is the title. So the title Long Island Compromise, you all know that I love it when like the title appears verbatim in a work, and that happens several different times in Long Island Compromise. And I have to say, the first time that it shows up is when a young Beamer is with his friends, and they're talking about some Catholic girls who are not willing to give up their virginity. I'm really down on the concept of virginity, people. That's why I'm doing like air quotes. These are some Catholic girls, which I also was like, why are we picking on the Catholic girls? But so these are some Catholic girls who are not willing to give up their virginity, but in fact are willing instead to have anal sex, which honestly felt like a little bit of a tired idea. I mean, that sounds very strange to say, but this is it's sort of this joke, I think. I mean, joke. It's just, you can tell. I don't love any of this so much. But this is kind of this tired thing. And again, it probably bothers me just because I don't like the idea of virginity to start with. and certainly not the pressure that young girls feel to have some sort of penetrative sex. But anyway, slightly different topic there. But I do feel a little bit, justified in talking about this for a moment because it's the title of the book. So essentially, Long Island Compromise comes down to this idea that, these girls will agree to have anal sex, but not vaginal sex with these young men. So that is what the title of the book comes down to. And then, of course, later, the ironic part is that we have the father decide that he is going to use this as the title of his memoir when he writes about his kidnapping. So it is ironic, in fact, that the father wants to use, this code for anal sex for his memoir. But there's also an element of dramatic irony, which is simply when the reader or other characters have more information than a given character. So in this case, Beamer and Jenny are always kind of laughing at their father when he brings up the title, this idea of Long Island Compromise. And the reader understands why they're kind of giggling and why they're kind of making faces, because the reader understands that they are thinking of anal sex while their father is thinking of his memoir. You also get the sense at the end of the book that Long Island Compromise kind of morphs again and becomes something else, which I liked that. I liked the idea of moving beyond, but I had a little bit of a hard time getting past this idea of this kind of ongoing joke that actually doesn't sit particularly well with me as being synonymous with the title. I will say, though, I love this cover. It really jumped off the shelves, and I would have read this anyway because I love Taffy Brodesser-Akner, but I loved it. And maybe that was part of the problem, is I really loved the font and I loved the colors, and it felt very 70s to me, and I was really ready to love it and to love the title. And then I was like, wait, what? This is the compromise we were talking about? The other example of irony that I wanted to touch on very quickly is when our narrator, in fact, points to an element of irony. This is when Beamer goes to rehab, and it's called the Bluffs. And I got what was happening there. I mean, the idea of bluff as a rehab facility, that someone would be bluffing about their sobriety, and you can imagine this is like a place in Malibu. And I looked it up quickly because I was like, what is the name of those? There are a couple of rehabs, I think, that are in Malibu. And it never became clear to me. Part of me was like, is this a particular, send up, a particular parody of one of these rehabs? And in fact, it is a parody of a lot of different rehabs. But I found the name actually a little bit too cute. And sometimes if something is too cute like that, seems a little too clever and a little too, sort of like it's been made up specifically for the novel in a way that does not feel organic and does not feel, in fact, like it has any kind of credibility or verisimilitude. Sometimes an author can get away with that by pointing to it, by saying things like, can you believe, the irony of this title? But in this case, it just underscored something that I was like, okay, if our narrator and our author, in fact, knew that this was maybe a little bit too cute, I would have rather, I think, skipped the whole thing. But so there's a certain element of being ironic in here that I think might have been more effective if it had been a little bit more subtle. And again, if it had generated a little more warmth. The next element of satire we're going to look at is this idea of exaggeration. So this is one of the sort of most common, and in some ways I think most effective elements of satire, is simply exaggerating something, and you can see logically how that works. Like if something's a little wacky and then you exaggerate it, it becomes more clear to a person why in fact that thing is kind of wacky to begin with. The important thing about exaggeration is there's a bit of a fine line. It sort of needs to be exaggerated enough that it's clear that it's an exaggeration, but it needs to be somewhat relatable. It can't be like too. And also, I think it can't be too silly. Sometimes I feel like exaggeration that gets too silly or is just not relatable is not, in fact, very effective. So we're going to take a look first at Less, again, by Andrew Sean Greer, because there is such great exaggeration in that novel. So this first thing we're going to look at is this kind of exaggerated travel anecdote. So on page 173, he's discussing being on a bus in Morocco. The rest is a Dramamine nightmare. I mean, that is so funny to me. Like that's, exactly what he's talking about there, but it's and actually there's a lot of use of product names in satire. I mean, it's very good placement there for Dramamine. The rest is a Dramamine nightmare, a drunkard's route up the mountain. At every switchback, the miraculous gleam of geodes set out for sale, a young boy jumping at the bus's approach, rushing quickly to the roadside, holding out a violet-dyed geode, only to be covered in a cloud of dust as they depart. Here and there a kasbah of fireclay walls and a great green wooden door, the donkey door, Muhammad explains, with a small door set inside, the people door, but never a sign of either donkeys or people. Just the arid acacia mountainside. The passengers are sleeping or staring out the window and chatting quietly. The violinist and the male model are whispering intensely, and so Les makes his way back, where he finds Zora staring out a window. So this is actually not super exaggerated. This is actually just like good description, and you can trade a little bit in cliche when you are talking about being satirical, in part because cliches are cliche for a reason. They are familiar to people, and so they can signal things very efficiently. But, that maybe wasn't the most exaggerated part of this novel, but I really do love the description and this kind of accumulation of details here. So now we're going to look at an example of exaggeration in Long Island Compromise. This is relatively early in the book, and it's actually a pretty good example of the kind of exaggeration that I related to in some ways. I understood what she was doing, but it felt sort of mean-spirited. This is something I'm going to come back to. So there's a concept of the straw man in rhetoric. So the straw man is essentially, you build up a figure, you build up sort of an effigy, or sort of like even a full-fledged characterization of someone in order to just pull that person down. And the reason why it's not very effective in rhetoric is because if you're just building someone up and then constantly tearing them down, it feels a little bit like you're picking on that person, and it feels a little bit mean-spirited. It's also not very effective because generally a straw man is sort of cliche and is sort of like a hyperbolic vision of something. And in fact, I think sometimes we get that when you think of Beamer and all of his drug use, and then when you think of Nathan and all of his anxiety, and then you think of Jenny and all of her sort of nihilism. I don't even know exactly how to describe Jenny. I will say, as I moved through this book, I was getting a little tired of Beamer and just feeling like that section was kind of relentless. And I was really excited to get to the next section with Nathan. And it was, it did feel better to be in someone else's head, but I found a lot of the same things, like the exaggeration and the hyperbole. I don't need people to be likable, but I need to have some kind of sympathy for them. And I did not have, in fact, a lot of sympathy for these people. One of the very most basic problems that I had with the book, frankly, it came up actually in an interview that I heard before I even picked up the book, where Taffy Brodesser-Akner was speaking with an interviewer. And basically they were saying, that the book comes down to this question of which is better, to have had tons of money and have everything given to you and know that you're safe, or to be poor and to have to work for everything and to be self-reliant and know that you're safe. And I was like, wait, that's not a thing. Like, there's a bad thing and a good thing here. Like, the debate is already over. So I did have this sense that there was a little bit of, the scales were weighted. And I think you see that spirit throughout. There isn't really a good sense of sympathy for any of these people, in this family who is in fact so wealthy. So this is the kind of exaggeration that we're having on the part of Brodesser-Akner that didn't sit particularly well with me. So on page 77, we have this. Noelle, of course, is Beamer's wife. Noelle sat quietly at the edge of the bed, perhaps so that he could register her displeasure with him. It was even harder for her to convey her emotions than it used to be, owing to how different she'd been looking lately. She had lately been fucking with her face. Which, that's just kind of mean. Maybe this is just because I do some Botox, people. I do some Botox, do some filler, I do all the things. This is a woman who is in the suburbs and who cares about, she's a former actor, so she's someone whose, self-worth is very tied up with her physical beauty, and she lives in a society where media is telling her she has to look young all the time. I have some sympathy for this woman, just in terms of like the cult of youth. So I feel like, in fact, Beamer and our narrator are really picking on her here. But more recently, she'd started injecting filler into various regions, puffing out her nasolabial folds, which necessitated then that she inject some into her cheeks so that they'd have dimension. The difference was subtle. She did not yet look like the amphibian version of a fish woman that so many women in this town looked like by their late 40s. She was still just in her early 30s, after all. But he feared she was headed there since, judging by a cursory glance at the attendees of the school's curriculum night, it seemed that this kind of easy treatment caused a dysmorphia, and if a ride down Beverly Drive was any indication, she would soon have lost the plot on what a human face was supposed to look like. So yeah, I imagine that there is a lot of dysmorphia, but my sense is like there's a certain pointed kind of meanness here that really starts with the idea of like fucking with her face, and also the amphibian-like fish face. There's a harshness to this And in fact, Beamer's a total asshole and he's a real fuck up and he's being a terrible, terrible husband. Before we move away from exaggeration, I want to take a look actually at Fleischman is in Trouble. It was so interesting to go back and look at the satire in Fleischman is in Trouble because it was much more effective for me. And I wanted to kind of figure out why, in fact, it felt so different. So we are going to take a look at the idea of exaggeration on page 11 of Fleischman is in Trouble. Toby turned around to see Cindy Leffer, a good friend of Rachel's who had a daughter in Hannah's grade. She took a moment to survey him. Ah, this. He knew what was coming. The head tilted 20 degrees, the exaggerated pout, the eyebrows simultaneously raised and furrowed. That's funny. I mean, that to me is funny. You can absolutely see this. Brodesser-Akner is so good at painting these pictures and making things vivid and real. Cindy Leffer is like doing this kind of, well, it's not even mock. I mean, she's probably a little concerned with him, but it's this kind of performance of concern. Toby, I keep meaning to reach out to you. There's a lot of italicizing in Fleischman is in Trouble. That I like. I'm a fan of the italics, not such a fan of like really going in for hardcore manipulation of the font. So she says, Toby, I keep meaning to reach out to you, Cindy said. We haven't seen an inkling of you. She was wearing turquoise spandex leggings that had purple claw prints on the upper thighs, like a streak of purple tigers was climbing toward her crotch, trying to get into it. She wore a tank top that said spiritual gangster. Toby remembered Rachel telling him that parents who sub out Y's for I's in the middle of their girls' names, and vice versa, at the end, are not giving their daughters much of a chance in the world. How are you doing? How are the kids doing? We're okay, he said. He tried not to adjust the angle of his head to match hers, but his mirror neurons were too well developed and he failed. We're plugging along. It's a change for sure. So I think what's interesting to me here is that the most important person who we are really invested in Fleischman is in Trouble is Toby and Rachel to a lesser degree. And in the beginning, there's this important thing where Rachel is being set up as sort of a villain. And so Rachel's friends thereby are also seen as somewhat villainous. But even in this description, we have a little bit of alliance between Rachel and Toby, which is very important and, gives us a sense that this is a marriage that is, they're divorced now, but that there is a certain amount of communication between the two of them and that Toby is still thinking about her in ways that are somewhat positive and maybe even a bit wistful. But we also have this warmth where Toby is wanting to sort of not have respect for this woman, but in fact, he treats her relatively well. He is, his mirror neurons, like he's so, it's not that he's empathetic, but he's so kind of respectful in some ways that he's not going to be rude. And he in fact does, tilt his head the way she is. And then he says this thing like, we're plugging along. So you have this sense of like a cordial interaction between the two of them. And certainly this is a parody and it is an exaggeration of, the kind of woman who wears crazy yoga pants and wears a spiritual gangster t-shirt. The t-shirts in Fleischman is in Trouble are so good. They are like a parody unto themselves. These women keep showing up with t-shirts that have the most incredible things written on them. And it's a great element that keeps popping up, and it's very effective satire. So we have a lot of exaggeration here of Cindy Leffer, and it is spelled Cyndi. So I really think this is very effective. And in some ways it shows, as opposed to our, to Beamer, who is, like not that happy that Noelle is fucking with her face, there's a certain malevolence there and a certain criticism that does not sit as well as does the exaggeration in Fleischman is in Trouble. So parody is a very important element of satire. I think people understand intuitively what parody means, but it's essentially taking a type or a vision or, certain details and making them seem silly, putting them together in a way that is recognizable, certainly as the original, but in fact either turns things upside down or exaggerates them. So it's basically taking a certain type, something familiar, and turning it into something ridiculous. So again, we're going to look at Lorrie Moore. Lorrie Moore's entire book, Self-Help, is a parody of these self-help books. So it's important, if you're getting kind of technical here, in order for something to be an effective parody, you need to be able to kind of identify what the original thing is. This is like a technical literary thing. So, in terms of Self-Help, which is the name of her short story collection, it is obviously a parody of self-help literature. In order to look at parody, we're gonna look at The Sellout by Paul Beatty. Unbelievable book. I really need to go back and do a complete talk on it, but it is an incredible satire. And again, one of the main reasons why it is so effective is because we really have warmth and we have respect for the main character, for our protagonist, who's really trying to do something really important in Los Angeles and wields all sorts of different elements of satire so effectively. I mean, Paul Beatty does on behalf of our protagonist. So in this case, we have this kind of parody of a parenting move. We have our protagonist, his father now is talking about this bystander effect that people don't help other people. Dad hypothesized that this didn't apply to Black people, a loving race whose very survival has been dependent on helping one another in times of need. So he made me stand on the busiest intersection in the neighborhood, dollar bills bursting from my pockets, the latest and shiniest electronic gadgetry jammed into my ear canals, a hip hop heavy gold chain hanging from my neck, and, inexplicably, a set of custom made carpeted Honda Civic floor mats draped over my forearm like a waiter's towel. And as tears streamed from my eyes, my own father mugged me. I mean, it is okay. There's so many different elements of satire that are working here. Yes, this is a parody of a couple of different things. One is like the psychological study. I mean, his father is essentially, running an experiment here on his son. So we have a parody of psychological experimentation, but we also have a parody of parenting. We also have all of this exaggeration. So the dollar bills sticking out, all of the different stuff, the Honda Civic mats. And, that's, again, this element of satire is often taking, commercialism and consumerism and capitalism. So it's a Honda Civic floor mat. There's a specificity there that is also very effective in terms of parody and in terms of satire in general. It's funny, it's unexpected, it's also a little dark, and it also is generating sympathy for us. I mean, this is a protagonist whose father is really not treating him well, who is mugging him, in the name of his thoughts about race. I mean, honestly, we have to look at The Sellout more carefully because this is just a very quick example of how incredibly well the satire works and how it is, in fact, involving all of these different elements. This is a good example of this idea that good satire is often weaving together all the different elements: exaggeration, humor, parody, generation of sympathy, relatability, all of these different elements together. We're going to talk briefly now about parody in Long Island Compromise. We're not going to look at the passages too carefully because I don't want to just like shit on them more. But I will say that the instances of parody that seemed actually most explicit to me were ones, again, that didn't sit very well with me. One is when Ruth, after the kidnapping of Carl, she goes to a psychiatrist, and you have this real parody of a psychiatrist. He's not helpful. He's a little bit lecherous. He wants her to come and see him all the time. He seems very opportunistic and just really gross. And one of the things he brings up is this idea of PTSD in a way that was very flip and in fact ended up feeling like it was sort of making light of post-traumatic stress disorder in a way that just didn't sit particularly well with me. So this parody of the psychotherapy experience was not, I think, very effective because in fact he is so unlikable and so exaggerated. And one of the things that sort of like collateral damage there is this idea that PTSD, because it is related to this character and because it is something that the family is not taking very seriously, it ends up just feeling just critical in a way that was not very effective. The other element of parody that really stuck out for me, at one point when Beamer is at the rehab center and it is costing a lot of money, and at this time the family is bankrupt, and Jenny is speaking with the person who is in charge of the rehab, and that person is saying that they need to pay for Beamer right away because they have a long waiting list, and they say something like, oh, all those Hollywood guys, and it's essentially a reference to all of the kind of Me Too stuff and the fact that all of these sex addicts are needing to get themselves into this rehab. But again, there was a flippancy and also the lightness with which it was brought forth. I mean, sometimes that works very well, but in both of those cases with Jenny and the person at the rehab sort of making light of the Me Too movement in a way that didn't seem, first of all, like a very convincing argument to me. It's very kind of flip, but it was added to this idea of these three main characters, the three children who are telling their stories, as not being particularly sympathetic, not having a lot of resonance with the reader, so that when they are kind of very lightly bringing up these really important aspects, actually, it falls a bit flat. Happily, when we talk about sarcasm, so sarcasm is when you say something but mean something else. There aren't a lot of examples of this in Fleischman is in Trouble, which is good. I think sarcasm tends to be, first of all, it's a little bit hard sometimes to convey it in literature because you have to make clear to the reader that what is being quoted is in fact meant to be the opposite of what the words say. But I really liked the fact that with Taffy Brodesser-Akner, she had a series of these phrases, usually said by Ruth, that were a little bit sarcastic. And I like the idea of Ruth as being a sarcastic person, but it would be, like somebody would start to do some psychologizing, and Ruth would say, "Oh, Sigmund Freud here." Or later, when she's having a moment with Arthur and he is, he's waxing a little poetical, and she's like, "Oh, Shakespeare over here." So you have this kind of refrain from her, which is obviously sarcastic in the sense that these people are not Sigmund Freud or Shakespeare, but there's also a certain warmth to that, which is why that instance of sarcasm works well. And it's why I liked seeing it in the context of Ruth. So I want to close this look at satire by taking one look at one really beautiful example of the warmth that we do find in this novel. There are several different instances where there is some really palpable warmth. This is Nathan and his father-in-law. Nathan tried to stand up. He hiccuped. But Hershey came over now and put his hands on Nathan's shoulders. "Don't worry, son," Hershey said. "Don't worry, you have a family. This is what your family is for." And so Hershey Szymanski, the failed clarinet player, instead approached his grandchildren. He put his hands on their heads and blessed them one at a time, asking God to make them brave like their forefathers, to give them good and courageous lives, lives that would mean something. He asked God to grant them ease and peace. And a little further down, the Szymanskis moved in a coordinated ballet of knowing how to do this. A beautiful harmony in what was that it was joy. What it looked like from the pews was this. Hershey Szymanski holds the boys by the head and recites those blessings by heart. Elaine Szymanski hangs nearby, her hands clasped, watching. Alyssa leaves Nathan and makes a speech that talks about the origins of the bar mitzvah in general, and then the origins of the boys themselves. She turns to the congregation and invites everyone present to see her sons through her eyes, to see how they contain the potential of the world, the continuity of a people, and suddenly, those two boys are the shining golden future of the room, and the congregation sits in awe, not just of the Fletcher twins, but of God and his miracles. I loved this so much. I also loved the fact that the failed clarinet player, Hershey Szymanski, actually echoed one of the most beautiful and other kind of really warm elements of the book, but also very sad elements of the book, which is when Noelle was talking about their daughter, Liesel, and how she was unable to play at her concert. You have these people who are meant to do well in these musical moments, and they do not, both Hershey Szymanski and Liesel Fletcher. So, very, very different people, but these two moments that are tied together a little bit by the presence of the musical instrument, which I loved. It was such an astute detail. But I loved the warmth that we see at the end here and this sense of family as coming together. And it was very important for me that toward the end, we did, in fact, have this idea of hope, that these twins who, have not been painted very flatteringly throughout the novel are in fact held up because they are part of a family who is warm and supportive. They are held up as a possibility of hope. So I'm going to end it there by saying that I really love the writing of Taffy Brodesser-Akner. In some ways, I felt like Long Island Compromise was a bit too mean-spirited, and that it was sort of working on this kind of this difficult premise, which is that there is very, very little sympathy for the main characters, for this family. And a lot of it was funny, and it was certainly entertaining, and it was well structured, and there was incredible plot, and I was drawn in. But there were a lot of times when I was frustrated by the fact that these people seemed so repugnant. And not, again, you all know that I don't mind repugnant people, but there has to be some redeeming quality, or they have to stand for something that is interesting to me. And the idea of these people as being absolutely horrible simply because they have wealth, it just didn't seem like quite enough. And yes, they had a tragedy in their lives, and yes, they did not process that. But the details of wealth and the idea of not processing their tragedy seemed a bit reduced. Like I wanted a little bit more to understand why these people were so repugnant, and I also needed to see maybe a little bit more warmth from them. But I will say that at the end, this showing from the Szymanski family really brought to mind the ways in which Taffy Brodesser-Akner is so talented. This is a book that is so colorful and so interesting and really entertaining, and one where satire is very much at the fore, and in some ways is effective, and in some ways isn't quite as effective as it is in the hands of people like Paul Beatty and Lorrie Moore and Greer. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.